He was told to collect the Quran, put it in writing, compile it. And his first response to Abu Bakr was, "You're asking me to write down all the Quran? How can you tell me to do something when Allah's apostle never ordered the Quran to be written down?" But wait a minute, I thought we saw a moment ago on one of these Islamic websites that the Quran was written down during the lifetime of Muhammad. It was cross-checked every year by him. Not true. That's a lie. If the Quran had in fact been written down, as Muslim apologists like to tell us today, then why would Zayd even raise this objection? Why are you telling me to write down the Quran when Allah's apostle never ordered it to be written down? His objection would be meaningless. The other thing he said when he was told of the task that was given to him, collect all the Quran, do a brain dump, as it were, from those who had memorized it, and find all the sticks and stones and scraps of material that had been written down. And his remark was, "I wish they had asked me to move a mountain from here to here. It would have been easier than what I've been asked to do." He understood immediately the enormous task that had been given to him. It was basically, he was asked to do the impossible. But he did as good as he could anyway. He struggled, he strived, and he collected as much of the Quran as it could. Now, Zayd protested the order of the collecting of the Quran into one final written form. Such a protest would have been meaningless if the Quran had already been written down. So again, that just shows us that the comments we hear today from Muslim apologists that the Quran was written down during the lifetime of the Prophet and double-checked by him yearly has no basis in history. It's just a lie. So now let's fast forward to the time of Uthman. Uthman, third caliph after Muhammad's death. He's facing another problem in his reign. He's basically facing a virtual civil war in the Islamic Ummah, in the Islamic community that had been established at that time. He's facing a civil war because the different major metropolitan areas were fighting amongst one another. And what were they fighting about? They were fighting over who had the proper Quran. Wait a minute. What do you mean who had the proper Quran? There's only been one Quran, right? No. They're fighting amongst one another because the Quran in this area was different from the Quran over here, which differed significantly from the Quran over here. There were multiple versions of the Quran that had found their way into the different major metropolitan regions of the Islamic community at that time. And what do I mean by differences? Well, I mentioned a moment ago that Ibn Masud and Ubay ibn Ka'b were two of the experts recognized by Muhammad. Ibn Masud, his Quran became the de facto standard in Kufa, Iraq, but his Quran was missing out of the Quran that Muslims have today, Surah 1, Surah 113, and Surah 114. His Quran only had 111 surahs in it, not 114 that Muslims have today. Ubay ibn Ka'b, on the other hand, his Quran became the standard in Syria predominantly, and his version of the Quran had 116 chapters, 2 more chapters than the Quran that Muslims use today. So 111 chapters, 114 chapters, 116 chapters, different orders of verses that appeared in this one that did not appear in this one. What's going on here? How can this be? There's only been one Quran. The Quran that Muslims use today is the same one that was given to Muhammad. No, it's a lie. And this is in their own literature. Now, you're asking, how did it come about that this Quran was different from this one, from this one, and from this one? How did we get all these different versions of the Quran? Let's go back to what I mentioned at the beginning. When Muhammad began his revelations, he would have a certain set of companions at this time. When he received another revelation, he would have a different set of companions. These companions that were with Muhammad wrote down what they heard him heard during the times they were with him when he had his revelations. But he didn't always have the same set of people with him during every episode of Revelation over this 23-year time span. So for instance, Ubay ibn Ka'b may have been with him 80% of the time, and he wrote down what he heard Muhammad say. Ibn Masud may have been with him during part of the time that Ubay ibn Ka'b was with him, but then part of the time when he was apart from Ubay ibn Ka'b. So he would write down a different compilation of the Quran. Aisha, Muhammad's favorite wife, Aisha bint Abu Bakr, would be with Muhammad during certain periods of revelation. She would write down what she heard. And so all these companions of Muhammad collected their own version of the Quran based on what they heard when they were with him during these periods of revelation, these episodes of revelation. And so thus we have different versions of the Quran that existed even during Muhammad's lifetime. It's these versions of the Quran that found their way into the major metropolitan areas, which Uthman now faced a virtual civil war. These guys were fighting amongst one another as to who possessed the proper Quran. We got the proper Quran. No, you guys don't, we do. No, you don't, those guys do. So how does Uthman settle the civil war? He recalls Hafsa's manuscript that was collected by Zayd ibn Thabit 20 years prior, orders it to be reviewed, edited. He assigns 3 other scholars or 3 other people to work with Zayd to make sure that everything is in there, is recorded, that they could remember. They do a minor editing of Hafsa's manuscript. Uthman then orders 7 copies of that version of the Quran to be copied, sent out to the major metropolitan areas that were fighting amongst one another with the order that this is the Quran we're going to standardize now on, and if your Quran varies or differs from this one, you are to burn what you have. Burn the evidence. Now, burning the Quran is not a new thing. You guys are all familiar with Terry Jones and his Burn the Quran Day in Florida. He wasn't the first one to order the Quran burned. It happened way back to the time of Uthman. He ordered the Quran to be burned. But why did he do it? Because these guys were fighting over who had the right Quran. So he says, he made an arbitrary decision. I'm going to take Hafsa's manuscript, which Abu Bakr sanctioned, ordered Zayd ibn Thabit to collect, which has been in the possession of Hafsa for 20 years now. I'm going to order that recalled. We're going to copy this one. We're going to send it out to the different metropolitan areas. And if your Qurans that you have out there, guys, differs from this one, burn it. So he ordered the destruction of competing Qurans. He ordered the destruction of competing Qurans which are actually more authoritative than the one produced by Zayd ibn Thabit. For example, Ibn Masud, one of the experts recognized by Muhammad's own mouth, when he heard these orders from Caliph Uthman, listen to what he said. He said, I acquired from the Messenger of Allah 70 surahs when Zayd was still a childish youth. Must I now forsake what I acquired directly from the Messenger of Allah? Ooh. When Zayd was still a snotty-nosed kid, Muhammad recognized me as an expert. Why should I destroy my Quran now when his means nothing? Essentially is what he was saying. Ibn Masud refused to burn his copy of the Quran because he recognized himself and his Qurans to be more authoritative than that which Zayd ibn Thabit had collected. But this is how we got the Quran. There were multiple copies of the Quran in existence. Here's another narration that kind of gives you the sense of what Uthman was facing. Uthman, O chief of the believers, save this nation before they differ about the book. Save this nation before we destroy ourselves with people fighting over who has the right Quran. This is in their own literature. So, how do Muslims respond to this today when you face them, when you ask them this question? Why did Uthman order the destruction of competing Qurans? Some which were actually more authoritative than that which Zayd ibn Thabit produced. They'll say something like this, well, they weren't really fighting about differences in the written text. It wasn't the written text that differed from one another, it was just difference in recitation. They were just pronouncing it differently. The text was the same. These guys over here just pronounced the Quran differently than these guys over here. It was a different pronunciation, a different dialect. Like in here, we say park the car, and in Boston they say park the car. That's what they were arguing over. The words weren't different, it's just the way they pronounced them. Is that a valid argument? Well, when Muslims bring this argument up to me, I say, okay, I'll play your game for a second. I'll accept your argument. Now, let's see how this plays out in reality. Let's say, for example, that we have in the United States a picture, and in this book, we have a picture of a red ripe fruit that we call what? Tomato. We call it tomato. In the UK or in London, what do they call it? Tomato. Difference in pronunciation, right? Not the same word. This is the argument that Muslim apologists use. So, here's how Uthman solved this problem. We say tomato, they say tomato. They're pronouncing it wrong, so we're going to make copies of our book, order the book that the people have in the UK destroyed, and we're going to send a copy of our book to them.
They'll still pronounce it.
Does that solve the problem? No. When they read that word, how are they still going to pronounce it? So you can see right away the argument that Muslim apologists use, that it wasn't simply a difference in words, it was just a difference in pronunciation, has no merit. There were actually different Qurans existing during the time of Muhammad that these different metropolitan regions were fighting over. Fun stuff. Fascinating. Listen to what Uthman said when he faced this dilemma about the different metropolitan regions fighting amongst one another. He says, your prophet was taken from you just 15 years ago, and you already disagree about the Quran text itself? You're disagreeing about the text of the Quran. He didn't say you're disagreeing about the recitation or the pronunciation. Uthman said, you are disagreeing about the text. How can that be? Your prophet's only been gone 15 years. Differences in the text. The Quran the Muslims have today is not the same Quran that was given to Muhammad. They have no assurance of that. They have no assurance of that. For example, when we look at the history, we actually find out that there were multiple copies of the Quran existing. Here's some of the compilers that we know about. Ubay ibn Ka'b, I mentioned him already. Mu'ad ibn Jabal, he was mentioned by Muhammad as well. Abu al-Darda, Zayd ibn Thabit, his Quran. Sa'id ibn Ubayd, Abu Zayd ibn Ubayd, Mujma ibn Jariyah, Abdullah ibn Masud, we mentioned him. Uthman, Tamim al-Dari, Ubada ibn al-Samit, Abu Ayyub, Abu Musa, Aisha bin Abu Bakr, Muhammad's favorite little wife, and Salim, the freed slave of Abu Hudhaifa. 15 known different compilers of the Quran. And Uthman arbitrarily selected one of these at the expense of more authoritative texts and said, this is the Quran we're going to standardize on today. An arbitrary decision by one man with no authority to make that decision. So even if you're a Muslim, and I hope there are Muslims that watch this, even if you're a Muslim, and even if you sincerely believe that the Quran that was given to Muhammad is the literal word of God for mankind, you have no assurance today that the Quran that you have is the one that was given to Muhammad. In fact, we can say it probably was not. Where's your Quran? It's vanished. It's not the one that was given to Muhammad. The Quran of today, in fact, the Quran that Muslims use today is not even a recension from the manuscript that Uthman ordered to be standardized. The Quran that Muslims use today is a much newer version that was selected from among 80 competing versions in Cairo in 1924. The Quran today is known as the 1924 Standardized Cairo Text, chosen by a committee in Cairo, Egypt in 1924. Did you know that? Did you know that even today there are two different versions of the Quran floating around? There is not one single Quran. You have a Hafs version of the Quran and a Warsh version of the Quran. And the Hafs and the Warsh differ in significant ways. The Warsh is predominant in North Africa and Western Africa. The Hafs is predominant around the rest of the Muslim world. And how do they differ? I'll give you an example. Here's one verse of the Quran where we can see a significant difference, and actually it impacts on a point of theology. I mentioned earlier that Muslims believe that the Quran has been eternally preserved on tablets in heaven. They derive that from Surah 85, verses 21 and 22, which says, "Nay, this is a glorious Quran inscribed on a tablet preserved." They say that word tablet preserved means that the tablet has always been eternally existent with God. This is one point of Islamic theology. But there's a difference in this verse between the Warsh and the Hafs text. Here's the difference. In the Hafs, Surah 85:22 says, "This is the glorious Quran inscribed on a preserved tablet." This is the basis for which Muslims today, the majority of Muslims worldwide, derive the doctrine of the eternal preservation of the Quran. It's always been preserved. But the Warsh version says, "This is the glorious Quran preserved on a tablet." On a tablet preserved or preserved on a tablet. Two different meanings. The Quran's been written down, but this verse that says preserved on a tablet has nothing to do with the Quran being eternally preserved in heaven. It says the Quran's been written down somewhere. Inscribed on a preserved tablet or preserved on a written tablet. Two different verses, two different meanings of the word. Muslims today do not have one singular Quran in existence. And the Quran they do have is taken from 80 different competing versions, selected from 1924, and those 80 competing versions came from a standardized version from Uthman that was selected arbitrarily by his choice at the expense of more authoritative versions that were recognized by Muhammad. Do Muslims today have the Quran that was given to Muhammad? No, they do not. There's no way a Muslim can make that claim. Now let me read you some comments from scholars who have studied this issue even more than I have. John Gilchrist says the Quran as it has come down through the centuries is not the single text without any variance that has been divinely preserved, without so much as a dispute regarding even one letter as Muslims writers conveniently choose to believe. Rather, it is simply but one form of it as it existed during the first 2 decades after Muhammad's death. The compilation of but one man, Zayd ibn Thabit, and commissioned for the Muslim world as the only text to be accepted not by divine decree, but by the arbitrary discretion of yet another single individual, Uthman ibn Affan. Wow. John Gilchrist, again, in his book Jam al-Quran, he says, the extent of the variant readings between all the different manuscripts in existence at the time of Uthman, before he singled out that of Zayd ibn Thabit as the preferred text at the expense of others, the extent of variant readings between all the different competing manuscripts, he's saying, is so great that they fill up no less than 350 pages of a book by a gentleman named Arthur Jeffrey, who wrote a book in the early 20th century called Materials for the History of the Text of the Quran. Arthur Jeffrey discovered that the different manuscripts that were in existence at the time of Muhammad's death, the differences between the different manuscripts was so vast that Jeffrey filled up over 350 pages documenting these differences. That's huge. That's significant. From a gentleman I know who formed his PhD on Islamic studies, and particularly studies of the Quran text, Keith Small. He wrote a book called Holy Books Have a History. This is what he writes in this book. He says, one written form of the text has been kept extremely well, but the process for establishing and keeping this form of the text meant the destruction and suppression of variant written texts, and the initial and repeated editing and improvement of the remaining text over a 300-year period to make the orthography of the Quran a complete phonetic system. So even Keith Small, who has studied this issue at the PhD level, he did his PhD thesis on it. He said the Quran was not even finalized during the time of Uthman. In fact, it wasn't finalized for more than a 300-year period. It took more than 300 years of editing, and re-editing before we had the final version of the Quran. 300-year time frame where the Quran was changed continuously. And then, interestingly enough, I'm going to play a video clip for you in a moment. In Sana'a, Yemen, in 1972, there was a fantastic discovery made. I don't know if you are familiar with this discovery, but during the renovation of the Great Mosque in Sana'a, Yemen, they were kind of doing some remodeling. And they tore open the ceiling. And in between the ceiling and kind of what the area we would call the attic today, they found a virtual graveyard of ancient Quranic manuscripts. Over 30,000 sheets of ancient manuscripts had been stuffed in this holding cell above the ceiling in this great mosque. And Dr. Sherb Quinn, I've met him, I've talked to Dr. Quinn, was called in by the Yemeni government to examine these manuscripts. He at the time was the foremost